Welcome to the National Security Hour. I'm Ed Huglin, your host for this evening. With me today again, and we're a pleasure to have her back, is Dr. Li Minyan. Today, we're going to continue our dialogue and discussions on China's unrestricted warfare, with a focus, though, on Chapter 6, which is Seeking Rules of Victory. To me, this chapter speaks to the current battle taking place in Israel. So we're going to speak to this chapter in unrestricted warfare with Dr. Yen and how it applies to what's going on in Israel. As we see Hamas terrorists apply unrestricted warfare in the slaughter of innocent civilians. As we speak to the strategy used in cognitive warfare, aka unrestricted warfare in China's terms, we see it used in various ways: ideology, religion, and issues. In this case, Hamas is using all three. Ideology, they're socialist and communist. Religion, they're using radical Islam. And the issues, they're using the Palestinian state as the whole issue there. So they're using all different ways. In this case, we have to be aware of the broader context that we see these false idols of socialism and communism being used to paint Hamas as liberators. They are not. They are terrorists. They are animals. When we see the use of radical Islam to justify the slaughter, the rape, the murder of women, children, elderly, and innocents, then we have to take pause for a second, and take a look at what's really going on. We see the issues of the so-called subjugation and intolerance of Israel used to advance a false narrative to drive emotional support for those in the West Bank, from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, and the Arab world, despite the fact that for centuries, the Arab world has dismissed the Palestinians themselves. It is, in fact, a perfect example of the principles of unrestricted warfare in what we see right now happening in Israel. Americans must understand these same principles are being applied in, as noted in Chapter 6, unsurprising and surprising ways. And I'll go into that with Dr. Yen in a minute. But this assault against America and Israel is not just by the Hamas. They're in collusion with China, with Russia, Iran, and others to include nefarious domestic enemies in our own country. Those enemies seek to subvert, subjugate, and destroy America. If it's not clear to you, our listeners, you need, when you see the adversaries chant death to America, not only overseas, but when you see them chant death to America in the streets of New York City, in Michigan, and other locations such as Harvard University, then hopefully that starts to wake you up. Before I bring in Dr. Yan, let's remind our listeners of why this topic is so critical to pay attention to, and why China is such a threat to our national security. It's far more than our leadership is aware, as they've built a network of allies to advance unrestricted warfare, as defined in the overall book, but also in Chapter 6 by taking surprise moves and non-surprise moves by themselves and with their allies. Each week, our listeners join us to discuss very strategic perspective analysis and assessments on the ongoing cognitive war. I've detailed the background and the definition of this war, the underlying theory and other aspects of it in my book, The Cognitive War, Why We Are Losing and How We Can Win. We can get insights about what Dr. Yin and I are talking about here today. The Hamas attacks on Israel, supported by Russia and China, are, in my opinion, exemplars of application of unrestricted warfare, cognitive warfare. It is a clear warning and call for preparation here in the United States. Why? Because we all understand that now, within our own open borders, the Manchurian President Biden has allowed similar terrorist elements and foreign adversaries in through an open door with free movement across the United States. So today, Dr. Yen and I are going to discuss and focus on Israel and part 2 of Unrestricted Warfare, Chapter 6. We'll discuss the following 3 key areas. Is Hamas applying China's unrestricted warfare in its attacks against Israel? 2, how are China and Hamas using the tactics of unrestricted warfare? And 3, are Biden, Xi, and Putin purposefully applying the theory of using surprising moves and unsurprising moves to drive multiple fronts against the U.S., and if so, why? Now, many of you are familiar with Dr. Li Minyan, but just to give you a little background for new listeners who are not, he's a medical doctor, PhD virologist. I always have the problem saying that. But she's a virologist and independent coronavirus expert. He has an exceptional education at the top 2 medical schools in China, South Medical University and Central South University. He was also a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong. He has a weekly broadcast on Saturday and Sundays, 4 p.m. Eastern, on here in the America Out Loud News Network called The Voice of Dr. Yen, which I also regularly join her on. You must listen to her show. She will bring you unique perspectives you're not going to get anywhere else about what's going on in the world from a perspective of China and understanding how China operates. Welcome, Dr. Yen. Glad to have you back. Let's start with the first area. Is Hamas applying China's unrestricted warfare in its attacks against Israel? What's your perspective?
Hi, Edward. Thank you. So first, yes, 100% for sure. Hamas learned from Chinese Communist Party, and they also combine it with their own culture and their own tactics. So that's why this time when Hamas launched the attack, the invasion, the war against Israel, Israel has no aware of that. Previously, Israel has a lot of experience against Hamas, right? And this kind of terrorists, always these terrorists want to destroy Israel, but it never caused such big damage, especially the intelligence failure. Why? Compare it to what happened 3 years ago, the pandemic. You will know when Chinese Communist Party dominantly involved and use their own special unrestricted warfare tactics, then the West suddenly become deaf and blind. It's because this is totally different from your culture and it's full range tactics. I mean, not only like what we see from that book, Unrestricted Warfare, that book written by the 2 PLA colonels, it's just a kind of very brief introduction. It can be published in China all over the world because CCP doesn't care. People know they are going to use these tactics, but they know you don't understand how they apply that. And we also learned a lot from our sources once again, and every time, one by one, because when we see something happen, then our intelligence or information from our source in CCP will tell us that's because of what kind of things China has done. So then we understand, oh, this is that kind of application. So little by little, we accumulate more knowledge in this field. So it's very cunning, sophisticated, and we can explain it little by little according to the situation.
So when we take a look at the surprising and unsurprising moves, and you talk about the tactics that are being used here in unrestricted warfare, you know, it's interesting as we've discussed in other forums about how Hamas was able to not be detected in this whole endeavor, even though they had a mock-up village, even though they've been bringing missiles in for a long time. And so why don't you give us a little background of your understanding of how China aided that potentially, and also how Hamas, from your perspective, you think was able to get those missiles into the Gaza Strip?
Yes, sir. So there are many ways they can do it. And these ways can avoid the detection surveillance from Israel and US and other your allies. Because when one hand, you know, as we always talk about unrestricted warfare, they need to understand the enemy first. So you are their enemy. So they have infiltrated into your government, the military, IC agencies. They understand how you arrange this kind of detective equipment, how you analyze your information, and how you handle it. So they know the weakness. And so especially when Israel, they focus on maybe the high level that kind of detective technology, and also they can maybe focus on bugging the encrypted communication by those among those terrorists, right? And also they are looking at whether there are some whole missiles shipped to Gaza Strip or somewhere else. You miss something that China teach the terrorists first how to use the new type, novel, encrypted language. They have a special name according to our source. They called it invisible language system. So this kind of invisible language system is China has spent decades. They have the very top linguistic expert. They developed this kind of rare language system. Like, for example, maybe this is a minority language in somewhere in Lebanon, or that is somewhere in maybe an island on the Pacific Ocean. And then they will mix some language and they make it. So in this way, you even don't have people understand the original language. So it's impossible for you to understand the message delivered by those language. And so they have developed the very mature protocols, and this was conducted by the international liaison. That is we call clandestine communist organizations in the darkness. And then they, like for example, our source show, they train these Hamas people and they train the terrorists from all over the world in China to learn how to develop and use such language. So even they talk in front of you, you thought they're talking about dinner. And another interesting thing is if you look at what happened in May this year, Iran delegation on behalf of Khamenei from their top government council, expeditionary discernment council. They have visited China, meet international liaison head, and also they visit Beijing Language and also Culture University, as well as the other language experts in Beijing. So this actually, just from the open source, if you understand CCP's tactics, you should identify that the significant meaning behind it. That means Iran delegation is working with China for this kind of invisible language system and other operation, of course. And also, as we talked before, China knows how previously Soviet Union failed against America. They have studied it. And for example, in Cuba, that nuclear missile crisis, why US detected the missile? Because it ships the whole missile. And it's like now you can detect the fentanyl if they want to ship drugs here. But if you separate it into parts and materials and reassemble it inside US or in Gaza Strip, and these materials even can be something for the daily use. For example, the very simple rocket missile can be done by some, like even flour, sugar, cotton, this kind of things, and give some chemical reaction. It doesn't need to be efficient, but they can make a lot and avoid your detection. So these kind of tactics are well applied and shown it works in this time, especially this time in Gaza. So definitely China will apply it against the US. And these are just some simple examples.
So it's really interesting because what you're highlighting here is something that we've discussed many times and that I read about in the book, is that a lot of this information is available in open source through open sources if you're willing to open your eyes, if you're willing to understand what's going on. So China and Russia and even the Mexican cartels, they have infiltrated the United States. They have shipped a number of things to the United States, the illegal bioweapons lab in California. The cartels with China have shipped fentanyl all over the United States. And so the point here for the audience is that this unrestricted warfare is also being staged and set up here in the United States concurrently with what they're doing in Israel. But there's a level of deception here that I'd like to get Dr. Yan's opinion on as well, because when you take a look at Israel and China, China is supposedly Israel's second largest trading partner, right? Much like they've gained a big foothold here in the United States as a trading partner with the United States. And for what? For critical supplies on different critical areas, okay? And so it's very interesting that not only did they do that, but then at the same time, China and Russia have built their relations with Iran, extended the relations with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other folks. And what we see here interesting is when this whole event took place, even though Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, had just finished talking about peace with the Arab countries at the United Nations, the day after this attack, who were the first two countries that came out that applauded this effort? It was Qatar and Saudi Arabia. The point there is it's the surprising and the unsurprising. They fortunately for us let their guard down and acknowledge that they're fully in support of Hamas. So we all know that the whole peace deal is a complete farce. So when we come back with Dr. Yen, we're going to talk about that level of deception and what she thinks about China's deception and using these, not only the economic partnerships, but also these so-called peace deals that they have with us. Be sure to make AmericaOutloud.news your daily stop for all the latest news and happenings. We must all do our part and share the stories, the articles, podcasts, and our videos so we can help secure America's future. We'll be right back.